There's a plank of oak sitting in my workshop right now that's older than my grandfather. It's got nail holes running through it, a scorch mark from what was probably a Victorian fireplace, and a color that no amount of modern staining could ever fake. Somebody 150 years ago cut that tree, squared it, and used it to build something. And here it is, about to become a dining table for a family in Surrey who paid more for it than they would have for a brand new one from a high street shop. If you've spent any time on Instagram, Pinterest, or walking around a farmhouse-style kitchen showroom in the last few years, you'll have seen it. Reclaimed oak everywhere. Coffee tables, kitchen islands, floating shelves, staircases, even garden furniture. It's not a trend that's fading either. It's growing, and if you're a woodworker, a restorer, or just someone who loves furniture with a bit of soul, you need to understand exactly why this is happening. Because it's changing the entire market for timber in this country. So let's get into it. Why is reclaimed oak so popular in Britain right now? What actually makes it different from new oak? And how do you spot the real thing from the cheap imitations flooding the market? Why Britain has so much reclaimed oak? To begin with, here's something a lot of people don't realize. Britain has an enormous supply of old oak simply because of how much of it we used to build with for centuries. Oak was the default structural timber in this country. Barns, church roofs, ships, mill buildings, old railway structures, Victorian factories. Oak was everywhere because it was strong, it was local, and it lasted. Fast forward to today, and a huge number of those buildings are being demolished, converted, or renovated. When a 300-year-old barn comes down in Yorkshire, or an old textile mill in Lancashire gets gutted for flats, there's suddenly a huge amount of genuinely ancient oak sitting there. Beams, joists, flooring, even old cartwheels and cider barrels. That timber has to go somewhere, and increasingly, instead of ending up in a skip or being burned, it's being pulled out, cleaned up, and turned into furniture. That's really the foundation of the whole reclaimed oak movement. It's not oak that's grown specifically to be reclaimed. It's oak that already lived one whole life as something else and is now being given a second one. I'll be straight with you, because I don't like exaggerating things on this channel. Reclaimed oak isn't automatically eco-friendly just because someone slaps that word on a listing. But there is a genuine environmental case here, and it's a big part of why demand has shot up. A mature oak tree can take somewhere between 150 and 200 years to reach the kind of size that produces good structural timber. When you buy new oak, even sustainably sourced oak, you are using a resource that takes generations to replace. When you use reclaimed oak, you're not cutting down anything at all. You're taking wood that's already done its growing, already been through decades of drying and settling, and giving it a new purpose instead of letting it go to landfill or into a wood chipper. British buyers have become noticeably more conscious of this over the last 5 to 10 years. People want to know where their furniture comes from. They don't want another flat pack piece that'll be in a skip in 3 years. They want something that feels like it has a story, and reclaimed oak genuinely does. That barn beam in your coffee table might have been holding up a hayloft in the 1880s. That's not a marketing line. It's often literally true. It's not just about the planet. It's about how the wood actually behaves. Now here's the part that I think gets overlooked. And it's the part that matters most to me as someone who actually works with this material every day. Reclaimed oak isn't just popular because it's sustainable. It's popular because it is, in a lot of ways, genuinely better material to work with than fresh-cut oak. When oak is felled and turned into structural timber, it needs to dry out, or season, before it's stable enough to use. Modern kiln drying can do this in weeks, but timber that's been sitting in a barn roof for 150 years has had all that time to move, settle, and reach a kind of equilibrium with its environment. The internal stresses that cause fresh oak to warp, twist, or crack as it continues to dry out over its first few years just aren't there anymore in reclaimed timber. It's already done all its moving. What you're working with is dead stable. There's also the simple fact that old-growth oak, the kind that was used in centuries-old buildings, often came from trees that grew slowly, which means tighter grain and denser wood. Trees today are frequently grown on faster rotations. The reclaimed stuff, especially anything genuinely Georgian or Victorian in origin, tends to have a tighter grain pattern and a richness of color that takes decades of natural oxidation to develop. You simply cannot fake that with a modern stain, not convincingly, not to a trained eye. This is the bit that really sells reclaimed oak to homeowners, even if they couldn't explain the technical reasons why. It's the character. Old oak carries its history on its surface. Nail holes from where it was fixed into a roof structure, mortise and tenon joint marks from a frame it used to be part of, color variation from decades of smoke, sunlight, weather, and handling, genuine tool marks from hand planes and adzes, which have a completely different texture to the perfectly uniform surface a modern planer leaves behind. You can buy distressed new oak that's been artificially aged with chains, wire brushes, and dark stain. I've seen plenty of it, and some of it looks all right from 3 feet away. But it's a costume. It doesn't feel the same under your hand. It doesn't smell the same, and if you look closely at the wear patterns, they're random and repetitive in a way that real aging never is. British buyers, especially the ones spending serious money on a piece, are getting much better at telling the difference. And that's actually pushing more demand toward properly reclaimed material rather than the imitation stuff. If you're thinking about sourcing some yourself, or you're just curious where restorers and furniture makers are getting their supply, it tends to come from a handful of places. Old agricultural buildings are one of the biggest sources. Barns, cowsheds, granaries. A huge number of these are being converted into homes or simply demolished, and the oak framing inside them is often in remarkably good condition because it's been kept dry under a roof for its entire life. Industrial buildings are another major source. Old mills, warehouses, and factories, particularly from the Victorian era, used oak extensively for flooring and structural beams because it could handle heavy machinery and constant footfall. When these buildings are redeveloped, which is happening constantly in cities like Manchester, Leeds, and Bristol, that flooring often gets salvaged rather than skipped. Church renovations, old railway sleepers, decommissioned ships, and even old wine and whiskey barrels all contribute to smaller but steady supplies. Each source has its own character. Barrel oak, for example, often carries a deep reddish tint from years of contact with spirit or wine, which restorers specifically seek out for feature pieces. Because demand has grown so quickly, the market has attracted its fair share of people selling new oak dressed up to look reclaimed. If you're buying, whether that's a finished piece or raw timber for your own project, there are a few things worth checking. Look closely at the grain first. Genuine old-growth oak tends to have tighter, more consistent growth rings because the trees grew more slowly. If the grain looks wide and loose, that's often a sign of younger, faster-grown timber, regardless of how it's been finished. Check for real fixing holes and joint marks. Genuine reclaimed timber usually has irregular nail holes, bolt holes, or mortise cuts that don't follow a neat pattern, because they were made for a structural purpose decades or centuries ago, not for decoration. If every distress mark is suspiciously even and repeated, be skeptical. Smell and weight can tell you something too. Old dry oak has a distinctive, slightly sweet, aged smell, and it's often noticeably heavier and denser than younger timber of the same dimensions because of that tight grain structure. Finally, ask questions. A reputable reclamation yard or restorer should be able to tell you roughly where the timber came from, even if it's just ex-agricultural barn, Midlands believed early 19th century. If a seller can't or won't tell you anything about the origin, that's a red flag worth taking seriously. Common problems you'll find in reclaimed oak and how restorers deal with them. Working with reclaimed oak isn't as simple as buying a plank and building. This wood has lived a life, and that means it comes with issues that fresh timber simply doesn't have. Old nail and bolt holes are extremely common, and every single one needs to be located and either removed or made safe before the timber goes anywhere near a saw blade or planer. Metal detectors are standard kit in any proper reclamation workshop for exactly this reason. Hit a hidden nail with a planer blade at speed, and you'll ruin the blade and potentially injure yourself. Cracks and splits, often called checking, are common in old beams, especially at the ends, caused by decades of uneven drying. Restorers typically assess whether these are purely surface splits, which can often be left as character or structural cracks that run deep enough to weaken a piece, which need to be stabilized, often with epoxy resin worked into the crack under vacuum or gravity to lock it and prevent it spreading further. Insect damage is another one to watch for. Old oak, particularly if it was ever damp at some point in its life, can show signs of past woodworm activity. The key word there is past. An experienced restorer knows how to tell active infestation, which needs proper treatment before the timber is used indoors, from old, long-dead exit holes that pose no ongoing risk and are often left visible as part of the timber's story. Rot is the most serious issue, usually found in timber that was exposed to the elements or damp for extended periods. Genuinely rotten sections need to be cut out entirely, because rot doesn't stop, and no amount of filler will make weakened structural fibers sound again. Reputable suppliers grade their stock and will tell you clearly if a piece has had rot removed and where. Old finishes, tar, lime wash, decades of dirt and soot, particularly common on timber that came from industrial or agricultural buildings, all need careful cleaning. This is usually done with a combination of wire brushing, controlled sanding, and sometimes gentle chemical cleaning, always working carefully to preserve the character marks while removing genuine grime and old, failing coatings. Let me tell you about a piece I worked on a while back, because it illustrates most of what we've just talked about far better than a list of bullet points ever could. A set of oak beams came in from a demolished cattle shed in the West Midlands, probably dating from somewhere around the 1850s, based on the joinery style. They'd been sitting exposed to the weather for the last few decades of the building's life, which meant one end of each beam had some genuine rot, while the rest of the timber, protected under the roofline, was in remarkably good condition. The first job was inspection. Every beam went over a metal detector, twice, because old agricultural buildings are notorious for hidden ironwork. Horseshoe nails, staple wire, you name it. 2 of the beams had old iron spikes buried 1.5 inches into the timber, completely invisible from the outside. Those had to be carefully drilled out before anything else happened. Next came assessing the rot. On one beam, it went in about 4 inches from the end, clearly soft and crumbling under a chisel. That section was cut away entirely, and the beam was shortened rather than risk using compromised timber in a piece that would need to bear weight. On another, what looked like rot from a distance turned out to be surface discoloration only a few millimeters deep, which cleaned up beautifully with careful planing. Then came the cracks. Every beam had some degree of checking along its length, which is completely normal for timber this old. Most were left alone because they were shallow and purely cosmetic, adding to the character rather than threatening the strength of the finished piece. 2 deeper cracks, close to a knot, were stabilized with clear epoxy resin worked in under gentle pressure so it filled the full depth of the split rather than just sitting on the surface. The finished piece was a long refectory-style dining table for a farmhouse kitchen. The client specifically asked us not to sand out the old nail holes or the tool marks from the original hand-hewn surface. Those marks are now a feature, not a flaw, and the client knows the rough history of exactly where their table came from. That's the whole appeal of reclaimed oak in one project. Reclaimed oak versus new oak. What you're actually paying. For people are often surprised to learn that reclaimed oak frequently costs more than an equivalent piece made from freshly milled new oak. It seems counterintuitive at first. Why would old used timber cost more than something brand new? The answer comes down to labor and scarcity. New oak can be ordered from a timber merchant in whatever quantity and dimension you need, cut to size, kiln dried, and delivered within days. Reclaimed oak has to be sourced from a specific building or salvage lot, which means someone had to physically strip it out, often by hand, transport it, inspect every single piece for metal and structural damage, and grade it before it's even ready to sell. Here's no factory churning out more of it. Once a particular batch from a particular barn is gone, it's gone. There's also simply less of it available than there is demand for it, especially for the older, tighter grain material that people are specifically seeking out. Basic supply and demand pushes the price up, and as reclaimed oak has become more fashionable in British interiors, that gap has only widened. That said, the value proposition is different too. You're not just paying for a slab of hardwood. You're paying for timber that's already proven over a century or more that it's stable, that it won't warp on you in a few years, and that it carries a genuine story rather than an artificially applied one. Turning reclaimed oak into furniture. Once the timber has been assessed, denailed, and any structural issues stabilized, the real transformation begins. Cleaning comes first, removing surface dirt without stripping away the character that makes reclaimed oak valuable in the first place. This is a balancing act. Strip too aggressively, and you lose the patina that took a century to build. Clean too lightly, and the piece can look neglected rather than characterful.